Okay, I guess we can go ahead and get started. Can everyone hear me okay? Thanks for coming out this morning. I appreciate it, especially on such a beautiful day as today, and especially here in the land of 1,000 golf courses, one of which is just a mere few hundred feet away. My name is Matt Ball. I'm with the Harvard Law School Library, and this morning we're going to talk about digital projects. Now, before everybody gets really settled in and gets their computers plugged in and everything, let me just tell you what this session is going to be about and what it's not going to be about. This session approaches digital projects from a project management perspective. So it's not technical at all, in spite of what it says in the program, which I think it said technical level medium. It's not technical at all. So I'm not talking about persistent names. I'm not talking about TIFFs and GIFs and JPEGs, resolution, bit depth, any of that. What I'm talking about is getting ready for hopefully what will be a smooth implementation of a digital project. So if that's not what you wanted to hear, then hopefully that gives you a few minutes to change rooms and or go outside or go play golf. Also want to thank John Mayer and Wayne and Elmer and everybody else for putting on such a great conference. It's been a wonderful couple of days so far, and I've learned a lot and I've met a lot of interesting people, and I want to thank them for having me here. And also want to thank them for having the official conference hotel be a golf resort, which I think is an idea that totally rocks. As it happens, I'm not staying at the Washington Duke Inn and Golf Club. But for those of you who are, and for those of you who haven't checked out yet, and you're looking for a golf partner for later on in the afternoon, and you don't mind someone with a handicap in the triple digits, then, you know, I'm your man. See me after the show. So before we get on with the show, I was sitting in my hotel room this morning and I was thinking to myself, you know what? It's the last day of a 3-day conference, and this is the second to the last session, and everybody here is going to be really tired. They might be a little cranky. I don't know. They're surely going to have sat through 200 PowerPoint presentations before, and really they're only going to be thinking about one thing besides golf, and that is barbecue. But there's still a couple of hours until barbecue. And I thought, what can I do to help these people get through the next 2 hours until they can have their barbecue? And the answer was obvious. It was chocolate. Yes. And so I stopped by the Eckarts on my way in today. So I'll start a bag on this side of the aisle and a bag on this side of the aisle. You may have to get up and walk around a little bit. But now there's enough chocolate in there for everybody to have 3 or 4 pieces, I think. So what I would recommend is that you have one now and maybe save a couple until later on when you start nodding off. And then that'll give you the jolt of energy you need to at least get you through to the question and answer period, at which time it's safe to leave without drawing attention to yourself. So let everybody get started. Yes, I'm sorry. There is yet one more PowerPoint presentation to get through. And maybe one more after this one. But don't worry, because lunch is on its way. And until then, there's chocolate. And how did I know that refreshments for this morning were really going to only include juice and water and not the big bowl of Hershey's bars that had been out for the last couple of days? Just prescient, I suppose. So who am I? Matt Ball. In addition to being an extraordinary carrot picker, actually that's a lie, not the carrot picking part, but I'm not currently the digital projects analyst at the law library. That was a 1-year term position that ended last November. And fortunately for me, one of the things that I did during that year was work on a grant proposal for a project that wound up getting funding. And so now I'm working on that project, which is the legal portrait project. And we'll look at that for in a few minutes. But what I'm showing you today is the work that I did as the digital projects analyst. And that was basically my main job during that year, was to come up with a way to standardize the way the law library was doing digital projects. And at that point, we had really only done maybe 2.5, but each one of them had been done completely differently. And we don't have a digital projects librarian. We don't have a line in our budget for digitization, all the money that we get for digital projects is really coming from outside funders. And it was felt that if we were going to continue doing digital projects, and we wanted to, then we were going to have to come up with some sort of set of guidelines so that when and if I left and there was nobody there who really knew how to do it, that they could just hand off these guidelines to whoever's job it became, and they could follow them down and get the job done. The problem with that is that the document that I wrote, which I'm not presenting today, which you should all thank me for, is the Harvard Law School Library Manual for Digital Projects. And it's huge. It's very detailed, and basically what I did was I tried to go through and imagine every contingency that somebody might have to deal with, no matter what kind of project they were doing, and just sort of talk about that a little bit. Consequently, it's really huge, and anybody who actually saw it and picked it up would probably be scared to death of doing a digital project and throw it away and go find another job. So I didn't bring that today, but it's there back at home. But what I did do was I sort of compiled some of the highlights of the manual into a program that I think everyone could benefit from if you're thinking of doing a digital project. And that picture actually is from a couple of years ago when myself and some friends of mine were harvesting carrots at a community farm in Concord. And I thought it was kind of a nice picture. What is a digital project? In the context of this presentation, when I say digital project, I'm referring to a reformatting project. So taking a physical thing and creating a digital version of it. So this is not about digital acquisitions. It's not about creating things that are born digital. It's about taking a book or a picture or a statue or whatever, and as my colleague Wendy Gogol likes to say, making it come out on the computer. There are a lot of steps between that, and that's what we're going to talk about. The example here is what we did with Bracton, which we just rekeyed, and that's a screenshot of its electronic version. Before we go any further, just to get a feel for who's here, how many people here have done a digital project like this before, and how many people are thinking of doing one? Okay, good. Well, I think this will be helpful then. So some examples of digital projects are, this is actually the project that I'm working on now, the legal portrait project. At the Law Library, we have approximately 4,000 portrait images of legal figures, so lawyers, judges, jurists, Francis Bacon, Aristotle, Sir Edward, George Clark. Now, these aren't the giant oil painting portraits that you see around the hallways in a lot of places. These are usually smaller. I think the largest is maybe 2 by 3 feet. And they're engravings and etchings and watercolors and photographs and things like that. So it's a fairly easy project, although it's extensive, because we do have 4,000 pieces. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later on. This is an example from the Harvard Business School. By the way, enjoy the pictures now while you can, because later on it gets really wordy. So that might be a good time to pop in your extra chocolate. This is an example from the Harvard Business School. They digitized 1,000 of their trade cards, which are, I don't know if anyone is familiar with this phenomenon, but way back in the day, this was a form of advertising. So salesmen would go around from shop to shop and they would leave these cards advertising what their product was. And in this case, it's actually quite complicated because there's a front and a back and the interior folds out. But that's just another example. Actually, this is an example of another one of our projects. These are screenshots from the Nuremberg project, which y'all may have heard of. We're digitizing right now for trial 1, both the documents and the testimony of the medical case in the Nuremberg trials. And up here in the left-hand corner is an image of one of the trial documents, and down here in the right-hand corner is the rekeyed text. So this is actually a project, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, that combines 2 different kinds of digitization, both imaging and text. This is a picture of the moon. This belongs to the Harvard Astrophysical Laboratory, I think it is, and taken back in 1852. This is a Claudin 1 mix cell that was cultured without docs express, only ZO-1. Oh, and no Claudin-1-MIC is detected. This is a project of the Harvard Medical School from their biomedical imaging library that's fascinating, and if any of you get a chance, I would recommend going there just to see what they're doing because it's amazing. But it's just another example of the sorts of things that can show up in a digital project. This is something from the herbarium. It's pressed leaves that have been photographed and documented, and I actually saw a digital photograph of this in the imaging lab when I went over there one day, and from just this far away, I thought that it was actual pressed leaves laying on their counter. And being a gardener, I went over there to look at it, and I had to get up this close to it before I could really tell that it was a digital image. This is a statue. This is a good example of a three-dimensional object that was shot from 4 different angles. We're actually contemplating another project at the law library where we have three-dimensional objects and how we will do it. And what I would like to do is do one of those cool 360-degree eye picks things, you know. I'm not sure we have that capability right now. But for now, this is what they can do. Okay, and as I mentioned, at the law library, there are basically 2 kinds of digital projects that we're doing. This is not to say there are only 2 kinds of digital projects in the world, because there are a lot more. But we're doing text and we're doing imaging. And you saw the example from Nuremberg, where we're doing a little bit of both. Text is basically a rekeying project, so you can either scan it and then run your scan through OCR software, optical character recognition, which turns it into electronic text, or you can actually have the text rekeyed where somebody sits down and retypes everything. Double keying is generally how this is done, where 2 different people retype the same thing, and then they compare what they've done and run it through a diff program, and whatever doesn't match, then they go back and correct. And that works pretty well for most things. We've had some problems with one of our projects, but we're dealing with it. And the other is imaging. And imaging is just either taking a digital photograph of an object, like those leaves, or scanning it, you know, just putting something down on a flatbed scanner, like a photocopy kind of machine, and then putting your images online. Here are some examples of what we've done at law. This is, actually, let me just go to it. So this is our version of Bracton online, and our opening page here talks about who Bracton was, what the work is all about the project, and how we were using the translation from Sam Thorne. And all of these are blow-ups so that you can go to them and get a better view. And then you can search Bracton through different ways. Here's the English translation. And where's Latin? There's Latin, and there's also an English and Latin, which is very impressive. So you have the Latin on top and the English on bottom. And, oops. Tom. I'm calling Tom because Tom Bruce is back there, who was instrumental in getting this done. Common Law, which is also a rekeying project by Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. And this is much simpler than Bracton. It's basically just the chapters of the Common Law broken down. Chapter 1, Lecture 2. And all of these, there was a little bit of discussion about how to do this. Actually, each lecture is one web page. And this was my decision because I didn't want people to have to keep clicking next, 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 next to get to the page, although page breaks are indicated by this sort of a thing here. And we're actually still discussing this project. And then finally, portrait project, which is the one that I'm working on now. Talk a little bit about the portraits. The interesting thing about the portrait project is that you have to leave our site to go search it. We're using systems and services at Harvard, what I like to call Harvard Central, which are Olivia cataloging utility, and VIA, which is our, I'll just go to VIA and search it. So actually, let me just go back here. On this page, we explain how to search and look for the portraits, and also explain that when people do so, they're going to be leaving our site and how to come back to it or to bookmark our page or whatever. And then when you go to the, just search for something. Spell that right. It takes a lot of coordination to turn around backwards like this. And okay, so here, so this is our actual product. So this is what we're doing with the portrait project. We're putting in all of this metadata, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes, cataloging information, and then we send the picture with the cataloging information over to the imaging lab. They do the imaging. They send off all of the information to the digital repository where it's stored. They let us know when it's been deposited. We make different connections so that people can actually view these portraits online. And I think they're doing a great job. It's hard to tell on one of these big projection screens, but the images that are coming out of it are absolutely amazing. So, and that's just some more screenshots of that. This is the Nuremberg project, which is actually going live, hopefully in a couple of weeks. We've been working on it for years, and we've finally, I think, gotten the hang of it. So look for that in a couple of weeks. So why do a digital project? There are basically two reasons. One is, and I hesitate to say this in a room of librarians, but one is to help preserve the materials by providing a surrogate for people to use for their research so that you can store the originals away, conserve them, put them in proper housing so that they don't have to be handled. So we don't think of preservation in terms of image it and then throw it away, because now we've got the digital image. It's image it and then let people use the digital copy for research so that we can save the other one. And the second reason is simply to provide broader access to a wide variety of people all over the world. Okay, this is where it gets wordy. So what I've done is I've broken down the steps of doing a digital project into 6 steps. Number 1 is selection and project planning. Number 2 is access. Number 3 is storage. Number 4 is cataloging and metadata. Number 5 is digitization. And number 6 is rollout and evaluation. Now, some of my colleagues have complained that there are really 8 components here because I've combined 2 in number 1 and 2 in number 6. But I contend that those are kind of related, really, and also nobody wants 8 components for a digital project because it's just you see 8 and you're like, let's do it next year. But 6 seems like something that you can handle a little bit better. So let's just get on with it. But first, there's money. Always money. As I mentioned, our digital projects are not being funded by the operating budget. We have to go out and look for outside donations for what we're doing. And this is certainly, I mean, I could do a whole session on budgeting a digital project, which I won't do today, maybe next year. But these are a few things that I thought it would be good to sort of point out that people need money for that they frequently forget. And the first one is conserving your materials, because if you're going to digitize materials that haven't been handled in 50 years and are starting to rot or tear or they're dirty, then you're going to want to have those fixed before you digitize them, because you don't want to digitize dirty pieces. The implementation of the actual project itself, long-term maintenance and new hires. Long-term maintenance is really mostly storage. You're going to have to, unless you're storing, well, even if you're storing your material on local servers, you're still going to have to buy those servers and pay for their upkeep and pay for somebody to keep upkeeping them. So we're actually putting a lot of things into the depository at Harvard Central, and they cost $5 per year per, now I can't remember what it is, but those are ongoing costs that we have to factor into our budget. And new hires like me, they have to pay for me. And there may be cases where you can draw on the talents of the people who are already in your library, but you have to remember that they're going to be, their time then is going to be removed from their regular duties, and that has ramifications further on down the line. And prepare a draft budget and keep revising it. And this is something that I can't stress enough. And even if you only know 3 numbers for your budget, write them down. And then as you learn more things, put those new numbers in and keep updating so that you have a real good control over your money and where your spending is going to go. And take a calculator with you everywhere. Because I can't tell you the number of meetings that I've been in where people have just been pulling numbers out of the air. And then when we actually sat down and started figuring, the numbers didn't add up at all. And if you had a calculator right then and there, then you could have good firm numbers or firmer numbers from the very beginning. Okay, the first step is selection and project planning. There's a little cataloging guy. So I know these words are small. Can everybody see them in the back? This is the part of the process where you start thinking about your digital project, what it's going to take to do it, what kinds of materials you want to do, the scope of the project. And I'm just going to read through these quickly, and ones that I think need a little bit more explanation, I'll stop. Goals and objectives, you really just have to decide, why do you want to digitize this thing? What are your goals and what are your objectives for digitizing the material? In the case of the portrait project, for example, that's the most used part of our collection of art and visual materials. And what happens is people are always calling Steve Smith, who is our curator, and saying, do you have a picture of Oliver Wendell Holmes right after he got out of the Civil War? And then Steve has to go to the drawers and flip through and say, yeah, let me scan this and I'll email it to you. And then they always call back and say, do you have a different one? And so then he has to go through that process all over again. And he does this a lot. And I actually work in the same room with him, so I hear all these phone calls coming in. So what the portrait project is going to do is allow us to put all of these portraits online so that when he gets these calls, he can say, go to this website, do a search for Oliver Wendell Holmes, find the one that you want, and then call me back, and then we'll get you a good reproduction. So that'll save him a lot of time. So that's one of the objectives of that project. Different formats, text, pictures, and audio. Just look at your collection of materials and decide what it's composed of. Is it all just text? Is it some text with some pictures? Because if you're doing OCR scanning on text and you have pictures, then that's going to have to be handled differently. So that's going to just mean a whole different step. The scope of the project. Do you want to do, let's see, you're doing Emily Dickinson's writings. Are you going to do everything that she ever wrote? Or are you going to narrow it down to poems or letters or whatever? So just try to focus in on your project. Associated materials, are you going to need introductions or bibliographies or some sort of finding aid for your material? For all of our projects, you'll notice the very first page was introductory material that explains about the material itself, about the project. Towards the bottom, I don't know if we went to the bottom of all of them, but it's information about how we did the project before, and then you click and you go to the actual database or begin your searching. And those are just materials that I wrote or that Tom wrote or somebody else wrote. But sometimes it might be nice, actually with some of our projects, I think with Bracton, did Charlie do the introduction for the Bracton stuff? So Charles Donahue, who's one of our law professors, wrote the introduction. So it's nice if you can get some actual scholarship in there instead of just, the digital projects manager whipping something out real quick. Look at your copyright restrictions on your materials. We haven't really had to deal with copyright yet because all of the materials that we're digitizing are either out of copyright or we own the copyright to. User and access restrictions, these refer to different types of users who may or may not be able to access the material, so you may have to limit it to just faculty or faculty and students. Access restrictions refers to how a user can access the material. Can they get to it from home, or do they have to be on a computer in the library, or do they have to be on a standalone machine? Most of these aren't things that you're going to really come across, but they're just things to keep in mind. Restrictions regarding copying, downloading, or printing the material. restrictions and other special circumstances based on the wishes of the donor. If your materials were given to the library and the donor says, I don't want these on the web, then you say, okay, well, can we digitize it and put it on CD-ROM and let people look at it that way? So just have to keep that in mind. The physical condition of the source material, you have to, this is great. This would scan wonderfully, but if it were 300 years old, it might not. So you have to take into consideration that. The physical characteristics of the material, how many pages there are there images, are they really big, or are they really small? And then how will the material hold up to the digitization process? And if there are any conservators in the audience, then I'm sure you're especially fond of that one. And we do have some pieces that would not hold up to digitization that we've had to say, we can't do this now, it has to be conserved, we have to think about it, or whatever.
I sense that you're definitely bundling audience considerations under goals and objectives. Is that...
No, we're getting to that later.
Did you spend any time seeing what other people have done? Obviously,
yes.
The Harvard portrait, that's heavily used. You know that there's a need for it because there's no other one anywhere else.
Right.
Is that sort of before this?
Yes.
People have come to you and said, this is something,
Well, yeah, that would be a good thing to do during your goals and objectives. And certainly you don't want to redo somebody else's work. And the common law is actually already online in a couple of places. But we felt that it would be an easy way to add content. And we're also trying to get a larger Holmes project funded. And so we felt like if we had something already up there, then that might help a little bit. But yeah, definitely you would want to look around and see what other people are doing before you start spending, $100,000 on something.
In regard to the portrait project, these were separate materials, each portrait being on a separate page or several on a page or something like that.
Exactly.
Did you do any, looking at the catalog records for those with illustrations, books with illustrations, or targeted, a time frame or individuals?
Most of the pieces of the portrait project, actually some of them were frontispieces from books that have been removed, and we no longer have the book information. So really, for some of the materials, we have very sketchy information, basically just what's on the piece itself. And I was an art major, so I know a little bit about art history and was able to sort of say, this looks a little bit like, so-and-so artist. And then I can look it up in different databases, the National Portrait Gallery, both here and in Europe and in London, and do some comparing and see if maybe they don't already have a digitized version. But we have had some people bring us books with really nice portraits in them. And so far we haven't done anything like tear those out or tried to figure out how to image those. We have this discrete collection in the art offices, and that's what we're doing right now. And probably after this project is done, then we'll look outside and say, how can we keep this going, and what other sorts of pieces do we want to do? Oh my gosh, more words. All of this is selection and project planning for materials. There is a little tiny section on personnel, which we'll get to in a second. So send a sample of your source material to potential vendors. So we're lucky at Harvard because we have an imaging lab on campus, and we can just walk it right across campus and get them to do some samples for us. Select your vendor, decide what your digitization specifications and costs are going to be. So for instance, for the portrait project, the imaging lab divided up all of our images into small format and large format. And anything 10 inches and smaller is considered small format, and anything 10 inches in the long dimension and larger than 10 inches is considered large format. And there are two separate costs for those, and because they're using two different setups, two cameras for those. So those are the sorts of things that you want to lay out up front. Storage of source material prior to, during, and after digitization, if they're coming from the depository or from storage or from the shelf or from somebody's desk. You just need to go ahead and figure out ahead of time where you're going to put all your stuff while this whole process is going on. Delivery and retrieval of source material to the vendors, how you're going to get it to them and back. We're lucky with the portrait project because I just take them in boxes and walk right across campus and hand it to them. But if we were using an imager that was on the other side of town, then we would have to, think a little bit before we hoisted, 600-year-old engravings into a truck and sent it across the river. Preservation treatment of source material before digitizing, we talked about this already. Special digitizing instructions. A good example of that with the portrait project is a lot of our materials are engravings, and if anybody is familiar with engravings, it's a plate that gets pressed onto a sheet of paper. And so the paper can be ever how big you want it to be. So sometimes the sheet of paper is this big, but the engraving is only this big. Well, we don't want to spend all the time and money imaging this whole sheet of paper, so we've told them at the imaging lab to crop it down to the plate marks, which you can clearly see on the sheet of paper. So those were instructions that we gave them before we even started the project. Training materials, if you're hiring people and, like, for instance, I'm doing the cataloging of the portraits, and so I had to learn how to use Olivia, our cataloging utility, and go to some classes, and you may have to prepare some training materials for people. And then processing the source material, and that just means changing its location in your catalog or, whatever you might have to do to get it ready for digitization. And then prepare a work plan and assign a timeline. And this is basically, I did the work plan and the timeline for the portrait project. And it was just basically a list of things that had to be done and in what order they had to be done. And it's a really good idea to already have that in mind before you even get started so that you don't get things backwards and start sending pictures over to the imaging lab before you've even cataloged them. Not that that could happen, but you wouldn't want it to by accident. And finally, selection and project planning for personnel. What are your staffing needs going to be? Do you need a project manager? Do you need a cataloger? Do you need some sort of computer person? Sponsors, advisors, donors? Who are those people going to be? What are their training needs going to be? Are you going to use current staff people? This is actually a big one for us, the curator of the digitized material. There was quite a bit of conversation about this because, and actually what we decided was that whoever is considered the most knowledgeable person of the physical material would also be the contact person for the digitized material, because most of the questions that are going to come in are about the material itself. And so that's the person who should be answering those questions. And if they get any technical questions about the website or anything like that, then they can just forward those on to our IT personnel. But this is the sort of thing that you have to decide, well, you don't have to, but it's a good idea to decide ahead of time, because for a long time we were going around in circles trying to figure out who was going to answer the emails for Bracton or for Nuremberg or whatever. Nobody really wanted to because it's just more work for them, but finally our bottom line was if you're the curator of this physical material, then you're going to be the answer person for the digital material. What are the time commitments involved, both for new hires and for current staff? Are there going to be conflicts with current staff and their current responsibilities? What kind of outside help are you going to need? Where's funding going to come from for new hires? Who's going to write the job description and interview and supervise them? And also, who's going to handle long-term maintenance of the project? So it's a little overwhelming, and that's just step one. But the thing that I should tell you is that these aren't, and when I was writing all of this stuff, I mistakenly called it the checklist, and which leads people to think that you have to check off each thing as you're going down it, but it's really a reminder list. Like, I would say for the portrait project, we really only had to think about maybe a quarter of all of those things because the rest of it just didn't apply. But we didn't know that it didn't apply until we got to it and said, oh, this doesn't count for us, we can scratch it off. So it's really just things to think about when you're planning a project.
You've been talking a lot, Matt, about imaging projects. Are there other considerations for text projects that you would have put in the list you just rattled off? I mean, does DTE development come under the category of special digitizing instructions, or does that show up somewhere else?
I should put a line in there that says, call Tom and ask him for XML markup instructions. Well, that's a good question, and I'll just sort of lay my cards on the table and say that most of my experience has been with imaging projects and not with text projects. So a lot of this stuff leans towards imaging and not text. And when there is a text question, then I call our IT person, or you, or somebody else. But at some point it would be good to flesh this out a little bit to include more text and markup and stuff. Access. So access means how your users are going to get to the material. And this is the part where you want to actually sit down and decide who your audience for the material is going to be. And I think for any project, there's more than one audience. And Tom actually likes to say there's a pyramid audience, where there are a few people at the top of the pyramid and a bunch of people at the bottom of the pyramid. And how you implement your project may depend on this pyramid of users. Are you, for instance, in the portrait project, most of the people who are going to use that are probably authors and journalists and people who are looking for pictures of lawyers and judges to illustrate whatever it is that they're writing. So it's not likely that it's going to be faculty members or students at the law library. These are definitely a very specific outside audience. And so in that sense, it's important to make it easy for them because they might not necessarily be an academic audience and familiar with catalogs and things of that nature that you could expect faculty members and students to be familiar with. How are users going to use the material? How are they going to locate it in the first place? Are they going to come to the law library website, or are they going to go to the catalog? How are you going to display your digital material? Is it on the web? Or is it through a CD-ROM? We talked about this a little bit before. And what sort of functionality do you want it to have? Do you want people to be able to search it? Do you want them to be able to print and download and email? These are all things that you have to think of ahead of time because they could have ramifications later on when you're coming up with your specifications and when you're doing your cataloging. And finally, the level of user privileges. Basically, who can have access? At law, everybody can have access to what we're doing. We're putting all of our stuff out into the world. If the access to your material is going to be through your own website, then you have to decide who's going to build it. I know very little HTML, so I defer a lot to our computer folks. Where is it going to be hosted, on a local server or on a university server? What sorts of security measures are you going to need, or is it going to have to be behind a firewall? Are you going to have to password it? Determine who will have access to the website. We talked about this a little bit. Is it open to the public or only certain audiences? And go ahead and draft a restriction notice that says, a copyright notice or something. If you're going to have one of those kinds of projects where people try to get to it and then they can't, then what are you going to say right there? Sorry, access denied, or we're terribly sorry, but something a little bit nicer. So go ahead and be thinking about what you're going to say. Design mock-ups of your user interface, and this is the fun part. This is where you sit down with paper and you draw a bunch of squares and you say navigation bar, picture of Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. here, text here, text here. Go ahead and start thinking about that early on. Create an HTML mock-up of it. Invite users to sort of test it and mess with it and play with it to make sure that it works the way you want it to work and the way they want it to work, more importantly. Go ahead and put in your hypertext links. If searching is going to be necessary, find a search engine that you're going to use or build one. Add graphics if you want to. Put the pages up on a test server. Once you get them all fixed, add your access restrictions, add security, review the interface for accuracy, and then go ahead and have people really pound on it and evaluate what they tell you. Storage. This first one is hard, estimate required storage space, because it's first on the list, but it really comes later on in the project. This comes after you've decided what your technical specifications are. How large your files are going to be is the main thing that you need to know. But it's one of those things that you want to try to figure out early on and then keep updating as you get more information, much the same way the budget is. What are the systems and services that you're going to be using for storing the material? Are you going to store it on a local server or a university-wide server or some other outside server? Again, where's your funding coming from for the long-term storage? What data and metadata are you going to need to deliver it? And we'll get to that in just a second. determine if the material is going to be maintained in perpetuity or if it's just for a short period of time. Because if you're not going to keep it forever, then that may affect some of the decisions that you make about how you implement the project. Decide who's going to be responsible for ongoing monitoring and preservation of the material, determine naming conventions for the files, and develop a plan for regular backups and disaster recovery if you're doing it yourself. We're fortunate that a lot of our projects that are being stored at Harvard Central, they take care of all of that. So they do all the data migration and the disaster recovery, and everything is handled by them. Cataloging and metadata. Before we go any further, just what is metadata? How many people here have heard the definition of metadata as data about data? Did you understand that? The first time I heard that definition, it took me a week to really figure out. It's the sort of definition that only makes sense to people who already know what metadata is. It's cute. It's like a neat bumper sticker, but it's not very descriptive. For digital projects, there are really three kinds of metadata. And I like to think of metadata as information about an object and its associated data. Does that kind of make a little bit more sense? And once you actually know what metadata is, it's really just cataloging information sort of supersized with more stuff. And which you can see in the three different types of metadata that there are. Descriptive metadata, which basically just describes the item. It's 8 by 10 sheets of paper with 6 square boxes on it. The paper is white, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you're doing a book, then this information also includes title, author, publisher, date of publication. So just all that basic information that you're really used to seeing already. Administrative, let's just jump down actually to structural metadata, which describes how a piece is put together. So if I were digitizing this, I would say, there are 8 pages, and the first page contains this, this, this. The second page contains this, this, this. And this is basically just to help reconstruct the item digitally when people are viewing it online. So that, if you're doing a book, you have the title page, table of contents, preface, introduction, body, index, but they all have to be in the right order or it doesn't make sense. And chapter 1 is composed of pages 10 through 15. You have to tell which is page 10 and which is page 15 so that everything gets put back together in the right order. So that's structural metadata. Then administrative metadata is the kind of metadata that I think everyone sort of stumbles over. And it can include a lot of different stuff, but basically this is the part that describes, this is the data about data part, where you're talking about what resolution your pieces were imaged at, for instance, what kind of camera they were shot with, what OCR software you used, as well as a bunch of other stuff that we're not going to get into right now. But that's that piece of it that really is the data that is describing other data. So now that we've got a handle on that, let's keep going. Determine how you're going to do the cataloging of your pieces. For the portrait project, we're using Olivia, which is a cataloging utility that was developed at Harvard specifically for describing visual materials. Who's going to perform the cataloging? Me. Determine what systems will be used for creating the metadata if it's separate from cataloging information. And in the case of the portrait project, a lot of that metadata, especially the administrative metadata, is created at the imaging lab because they're the ones that are shooting it. So they're the ones that have all of that information about what camera they used, what resolution things were shot at, etc. And then develop cataloging standards. Determine if an item level or group level record is going to be needed. Determine the extent of your cataloging records. Determine the subject classification ahead of time. And decide issues regarding authority control. And all of that for the portrait project, for example, were decided up front. We just sat down with Olivia, went through all of the possible fields that could be filled out, and said, these are the fields that we want to include in our records. And most of them are fields that we actually have the information for. Very few of them do. I have to sort of go out and hunt for more information. Determine what data and metadata will be necessary for each item. Prepare a collection level catalog record so that if people don't come to your website and do go to the catalog first, then they can still get to your digital material. Catalog the individual items, which this is going to be the longest and most expensive part of your project, probably, because it has to be done by hand by a person. So you're paying for their time, and it takes a long time to do it. It's taking a year and a half to do the 4,000 portrait images that we're doing, just to give you some perspective. Create a script to compile the metadata if necessary. We don't have to do that because they're doing it at the imaging lab. And create a database for tracking your material through the digitization process. So when I take a portrait out of its box and set it down to catalog it, then it's on my desk. Once it's cataloged, then it goes into this box. Once this box is full, then a lid gets put on it, and it gets taken to the imaging lab. Once they image it, they call me, and I go and pick it up and bring it back, and then it's time for rehousing. But what's important is to know where it is through all of that different process. And, you know, it says create a database, which is, it sounds scary, but it's really just a spreadsheet kind of a thing, just so that you can keep track of where your pieces are if you have a lot of different pieces. All right, the sexy part, digitization, finally. This is actually a short section, believe it or not. No, it's not. I'm sorry. It's not too bad, though, but it's what everybody wants to talk about anyway. So we talked about this a little bit, the functionality of the final product. What do you want people to be able to do with it? Do you want them to be able to zoom in? Do you want there to be different navigational features, printing, searching, browsing, annotating, etc.? Is your product going to be text or image, or both? It could be both. If it's an image, what kind of image is it? Is it color? Is it grayscale? Is it 2-bit black and white? Do you need absolute accuracy in your color, or can they fudge that a little bit? You're probably going to have an archival copy and a delivery copy, and the archival copy is the really big, expensive file that gets stored away, and then the delivery copy is the one that people see on their screen. And are there any enhancements that you want to make in your image? Because there's a lot that they can do with Photoshop and, you know, digital cameras and stuff. And it could be that you may have something that, while it's in its paper form, is difficult to read, but that once you image it, you can do something to it to make it easier to read. And you can do that. You would just want to tell people that that's what's happening so that they don't think that they're seeing an actual accurate image. Is text conversion necessary? Is searchability necessary, or will a digital photocopy suffice? And do you need to call Tom Bruce to do some XML markup? How are you going to digitize your pieces? Are you going to scan them? Are you going to key them? Are you going to photograph them? Are you going to do it in-house? We actually have a scanner up in the art offices, but it's not nearly as nice as the cameras that they're using over at the imaging lab. And since what we want are archival copies, we're sending them over there. Are there special handling needs for the source material? Are they really brittle? And, you know, do people need to wear gloves, the imagers, when they're using them, or is it okay just to use their bare hands? Rehousing and bibliographic maintenance, when they come back, what are you going to do with them? Do they just go back to where they started, or is this going to be part of a larger project of sending things to a depository or something like that? Do you need to write up some scanning or keying instructions? What kinds of quality control standards are you going to have? How are you going to process, transfer, and house the material? We talked about this a little bit earlier. And if you made a preservation plan before, then it might be time to go ahead and implement that. If you're doing your digitization in-house and not sending it out, you want to get all of your material together, review your scanning instructions, sit down and do the digitization, look at your images to make sure that they look the way that you want them to look, redigitize anything that didn't come out right, go ahead and process the digital images, putting in the metadata, storing them, and then archiving the images in whatever repository you've decided to put them in. And if it's done by an outside vendor, you still want to get all of your materials together, deliver your material to the vendor, retrieve it, check the images, and this is really important, that every image has to be checked to make sure that not only is it imaged correctly, but that it's also connected to the correct cataloging record. And then if you need to re-image some things, contact your vendor about that. And then finally, roll out an evaluation. This is where you get to have a big party, almost. For rollout basically means turning your project on and telling the world that it's there. So you might want to develop a publicity plan, either publicize in magazines or your local newsletters or whatever. Review your collection before you turn it on, as we like to say. Test all the links to make sure everything is working. Those users that you had as test users from before at the very beginning, you might want to bring them in again and say, here's our final product. What do you think of it now? Make any necessary changes that you need to. Move your HTML pages from the test server to a production server. Revise the cataloging records. If you have, especially just a collection level record, go ahead and put in the URL, and then turn it on and publicize it. And for evaluating, again, you would want to develop an evaluation plan. So you might want to survey people, solicit feedback from users, from project staff. If you have the money, you might want to hire some consultants to help you, create a focus group, decide how long the evaluation is going to last, implement your plan, compile the results, and decide what changes you need to make, and then how you're going to implement those changes. And that's it. Yes?
You had spoken about using outside vendors to do the imaging. Are there a lot of outside vendors there? I mean, I assume the image lab at Harvard is charging you to do this.
Yes.
How do they compare, and sort of, are there a lot of outside folks that are sort of out there wanting to do that?
In our area, besides the imaging lab at Harvard, there are really only 2 places, I think, that I would feel safe sending valuable material to. I think that our imaging lab, well, they do charge. Their recovery, cost recovery operation, and they do charge. And I think that their prices are a little on the high side, but we benefit from the fact that they're a part of a set of systems and services at Harvard that we're using, and they all talk to each other. And plus, they're just a few hundred yards away, and so it's worth it to us not, to be able to just walk our materials over there instead of having to ship them somewhere. Yes?
You'd mentioned that your position was grant funded, I believe.
That's correct.
Was the entire project also grant funded?
Yes. The portrait project in particular is part of an LDI project at Harvard, which is Library Digital Initiative, which is a 5-year, now 6-year project to help build the infrastructure for digital projects at Harvard. And what they would do is they would basically provide matching funds. So LDI is providing half of the money for the project, and then the law library is providing the other half.
My question is how much of the planning, decision-making process was done as part of the grant application process as opposed to after you came on board?
Most, not enough was done before, because once they hired me and we started working, there were a lot of things that we had to go back and refigure because, and not to blow my own horn, but because I wasn't included in the earlier part of the process because I wasn't on board with the project yet, then they didn't know about a lot of this stuff. So I was able to go back and say, oh, well, we need to redo this or we need to look at this again. In an ideal world, 80% of this would happen before the project even begins and before money is spent.
As someone who was in on the non-planning process that preceded Matt, an awful lot of what went on with a huge project like Nuremberg, which if it were taken all the way would span multiple millions of dollars and a decade in time to do the full Nuremberg military program.
Right.
We were into that on a limited basis just to find out what it was going to cost.
Exactly.
We were at the end of doing the medical case before we had any real estimate of what the costs were, and frankly, that was a dance with the donor, who lost all his money post September 11th, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it really was a probe to find out what it would cost to do the entire thing. And at that point, we were looking at that donor or other people to say, okay, where's the rest of the cash to do it?
Right.
Your checklist from the presentation today, what do you have on the web?
I think these slides will be on the CALI site, but I can also email you a copy of the larger checklist if you want. It's really only 5 pages, single-spaced, so it's not that big.
When you say you catalog the item, do you catalog every image?
Yes.
And we're talking mark catalog?
It's mark level cataloging. I've done regular mark cataloging in my life, so I bring that same cataloging mentality to the images, but I have to say it's different when you're cataloging visual materials than when you're cataloging books.
It becomes an extraordinary, and my heart goes out to it. It's got to be an extremely huge job. And I was worried that as that kind of project goes forward, the cataloging portion could become not doable as the scale grows. And the reason I say that has to do, I feel that way. In a typical traditional database, you've got records creating files. You have a structured query language to get at this data in these files. And if you control that language through the kinds of things Tom's talking about, HTML, however mechanism you have to control all that stuff, you inherently really don't have to catalog it per se because the database does all that for you when you retrieve it. And I wonder if there's a way to do all this stuff without having the intermediary stuff needed to catalog it along the way. In other words, you're using the structure in your design of the database itself to then get at it at all costs anyway.
If I may, I think that's what actually happened in our work. We had a document analyst looking at each document for basic dividend graphic information, probably what, 5,700 metadata items of some kind or other.
Something ridiculous.
It was huge and detailed and well worth doing because you knew it was going to be done once. And at that point, sure, you can crosswalk all that stuff into whatever kind of OPAC record you want to, because it's all there, and you certainly don't have to beat the document analyst over the head and say, oh, it's Mark 301, or what have you. And yes, it does come out of that. I count a lot of the image metadata that's being generated as transformable and so forth and so on. And sure, you can do that. You do need to take some care as you're designing that database that you are capturing all the stuff you would want for cataloging. But in most cases, as you say, that really has not been a problem. What is an interesting problem, it seems to me, if I could launch off into a little sermonette, is a certain tension between a library cataloger at Harvard's approach to this sort of stuff and a cheap XML hacks approach to this stuff, such as my own.
Right. Yes, there is a big
difference. Library catalogers believe that you touch something once only, yeah. And in the case of these kinds of historical projects that we've been doing, that's true. But in the case of something like text markup, which we all recognize to be limited by economic considerations, no markup project is ever you tend to work by successive approximation as the technology gets better, and there's a certain amount of it in the planning process. There's a certain amount of tension between those two views. Mm-hmm. That's also happened somewhat at the rollout stage, where nothing at Harvard they were quite good enough for the public to see.
No, we can't turn it on yet. But there's also I hear what you're saying, and certainly for a lot of the portraits, they already have cataloging records in our catalog in Hollis. And I've been screaming at people to create some way of simply transferring that directly from all of that information directly from Hollis into the database, but right now they can't. Our sort of in-between step is that we are able to set up a template. So if there's repeating information, like for instance, the piece is held at the Harvard Law Library, or it's part of something called the Digital Project Collection or whatever, then all of that repeating information can be stored so that really all you have to enter are the discrete information bits from each individual piece. But it's going to get better, hopefully, since it's my career. Yes. I might change my career.
What are some considerations that you take into account in deciding whether or not to do OCR or whether or not to have text rekey?
Cost, for one thing. Rekeying right now is a little bit cheaper than OCR, but also the quality of the text. And I've seen some projects that were scanned and actually not scanned and OCR'd, but then not corrected. And like 200-year-old books. And you know how sometimes an F will look like an extended S in the script? So you're reading it online, and it's like they've spelled it instead of professor, processor. throughout the entire text. And I'm just amazed that people can do that without going back and correcting. But a lot of it, you just have to decide how much it's going to cost, and is it going to be easy to do your OCR, and how much correction is going to need to happen. Yes, sir.
On that point, I was looking at a project at Double Key where we did a survey with 5 different vendors, and we found one vendor in China that was really, really good. And the others were, we were trying for a 95 plus percent of accuracy. The Chinese, we got close to 98 something.
That's
so
great.
The other people, we were around 93 or 90. And I spoke to someone at the University of Chicago that did a really large text digitization project, and I asked about quality control, and the answer I got was we didn't go back and check.
It's baffling to me.
It's extremely difficult to do it, but they didn't even try. So.
Yeah. And I think that if you're going to spend the time and the money to do all of that upfront part, and I mean, a lot of people I think are concentrating on the sexy part, which is the digitizing, and not planning well, and they're not following up well. And that's what I hope people will change.
Extremely, very experienced in the game. And Brad is absolutely 100% accurate in most English labs.
Yeah. And it's beautiful and amazing.
We had no problems with it whatsoever. On Nuremberg, for all sorts of reasons, there were disasters there. The biggest one was the source material was bad 1940s copy technology for the most part, either carbons or lead copies or what have you. Mostly being kept from film, so there was a lot of fade out at the edges of the film. I don't think you couldn't see it, first of all. But even keying was quite dubious with this stuff. We had a lot of problems with correction.
And it was just impossible for those keyers to really tell the difference between a C and an E, because we have someone now proofreading those transcripts, and she has to get this close to be able to tell if something is an E or a C. And when you're paying people to just plow through as much as they can, then that's not the sort of thing that they can catch.
I guess looking at the Allen's blood I left out before the result of that process, and we got on Harvard's money as well. I would say that one thing you need to do if you're doing a large project like that is be very sure that you've done complete representative sampling of all the source material before it goes out. We got some very nasty surprises from that. We ended up keying something like 30 rolls of film that we would not have had to had we not made assumptions about what we're doing. So getting somebody just to read through all the stuff may not be a bad idea.
Right. Any more questions?
Is anybody pulling together a page or something that has all these projects? These are great projects, and I think we all kind of sort of looking over each other's shoulders at it. Is anybody doing that?
Projects throughout the academic community? Not that I know of. Yeah, thanks. Well, thanks everyone for coming, and thanks for your attention. All right, it's almost time to eat.